Tom Baxter had never been one to chase luxury or gated communities, but when he and his wife Lena moved into Benson Park, it was under the pretense of a new beginning. On the surface, Benson Park was pristine. Rows of manicured hedges, identical white mailboxes, neighbors who waved just the right amount. Everything looked like it belonged in a magazine spread about suburban perfection, but beneath that polished surface, Tom sensed an undercurrent he couldn't quite name. It wasn't hostility exactly. It was something more subtle, more rehearsed. People didn't just wave. They waited for eye contact, then executed the exact same nod, the same smile. It wasn't friendly. It was efficient. Lena noticed it too, though she said little at first. She'd been briefed, of course, her placement here wasn't random. Officially, she was a semi-retired contract analyst with a bland federal background, recently relocated. Unofficially, she was a quietly embedded federal agent, running point on a quiet but high-level investigation into suspicious private enforcement activities that had started surfacing in neighborhoods like this across the country. She wasn't undercover in the Hollywood sense. No fake wigs or aliases. Just a new address, a new mailbox, and a quiet presence. But Lena didn't miss details. The neighborhood's self-appointed council, for instance, had no official city charter, but still operated with bureaucratic rigidity. They issued written warnings for things like visual nonconformity and personal presentation violations. One of the notices Lena received in the first 2 weeks politely reminded her to adhere to aesthetic community standards when outside her home. The phrase stuck with her. Not rules, not dress code, aesthetic standards. It was a Tuesday afternoon, dry and still when it happened. Lena had just returned from a jog. Nothing out of the ordinary. Leggings, a t-shirt, a lightweight windbreaker. Nothing anyone would blink at in a public park. But as she stepped onto the porch, 2 men in matching dark uniforms rolled up the sidewalk in an electric patrol cart. Their badges were unfamiliar, their uniforms unmarked, and their demeanor immediately cold. One of them stepped off the cart, approached her without greeting, and said in a low, even voice, "Ma'am, we need you to come with us. There's been a violation." Lena stared at them. "A violation of what?" she asked. The other man, broader, with mirrored sunglasses and a sharp crew cut, responded without inflection. "Non-compliance with residential conduct protocols. You'll need to come to the administrative station for processing." Tom had just stepped outside with the trash when he heard it. He froze mid-step, watching the scene unfold. Lena didn't raise her voice. She didn't panic. She simply crossed her arms and said calmly, "If you're here in an official capacity, I'll need to see your identification, along with the citation in writing." That was when the taller man stepped closer and lowered his voice. Too low for Tom to catch all of it. But Lena's expression didn't change. Her eyes narrowed slightly and she said nothing. A tense silence followed. Then, without warning, the 2 men backed away, mumbled something about returning later, and drove off. Lena stood on the porch, arms still folded, watching them disappear down the road. Tom walked over slowly. "What the hell was that?" he asked. Lena's voice was quiet. "Not local law, not even private security. Those uniforms weren't registered. They're testing reactions." Tom didn't reply right away. He looked out toward the road, the silence heavier than before. Something told him this wasn't the last visit. The following morning, the neighborhood resumed its scripted rhythm as if nothing had happened. Lawn sprinklers clicked on precisely at 7. Dogs were walked in synchronized routes, and the same silver SUV that passed their house every morning rolled by once again, tinted windows offering no view inside. Tom and Lena sat at the breakfast table, both pretending to read. Him a local paper, her an unread newsletter from the community council. The silence between them wasn't tense, just thoughtful. They were 2 people used to planning carefully, reacting methodically. The incident from the day before hadn't rattled them, but it had shifted the temperature of their environment. That morning, the temperature had changed again. At 9:42 a.m., a delivery van pulled into their driveway. It was unmarked, matte black with no license plate. That alone was enough to set off alarms in Tom's head. The driver stepped out without urgency, opened the rear doors, and pulled out a flat white package the size of a tabletop. Too big to be ignored, too clean to look like anything other than deliberately prepared. He didn't ring the bell. He left it at the door, gave a brief glance at the window, and returned to his van. Tom watched from behind the curtain. As the van reversed out of the driveway, it didn't go back to the main road. It took a sharp left and rolled down the gravel path that ran between the homes, a maintenance road not open to regular vehicles. Within seconds, it had vanished. Tom opened the door and stared at the package. Lena joined him a moment later, crouching beside it, checking for wires or pressure sensitivity, her motion efficient but cautious. No markings, no sender, no weight shift when moved. Just a perfectly taped rectangle with a small card taped to the top that read, in printed all caps, Courtesy Compliance Pack. They brought it inside and opened it carefully, cutting away each edge with a sterilized knife. Inside was a folded sheet of clothing, a beige cardigan, a floor-length gray skirt, and a pair of white slip-on shoes. Folded on top was another note. We hope this helps you make the right decisions in your integration journey. Respecting shared values is the cornerstone of our harmony. Tom let out a low, sharp breath. Lena didn't speak at first. She examined the clothes with professional detachment, then returned to the box and began checking for embedded trackers. Beneath the lining, she found a small adhesive tag tucked under the hem of the cardigan. Passive RFID. It was primitive by federal standards, but the message wasn't technical, and it was symbolic. This wasn't about enforcement. It was about control through social pressure. They were telling her how she was supposed to look, move, present herself. Not by law, but by expectation. And the expectation came enforced by people pretending to be something they weren't. Later that afternoon, Tom received an email from a local council representative. It was brief and casually worded, but its tone was unmistakably condescending. Hi, Tom. We noticed a minor incident yesterday that may have led to some confusion involving a routine community patrol. Just a heads up. Our neighborhood values cohesion, and sometimes miscommunications happen during introductory enforcement steps. If Lena has any questions about expected appearance or engagement standards, our office is happy to provide guidance. Let's make sure this little misunderstanding doesn't get in the way of a harmonious welcome. Tom read it twice. There was no apology, no signature, no official address. Just vague language framed as neighborly advice. But the real punch was in the phrase introductory enforcement steps. It wasn't miswritten, it was intentional. The incident hadn't been a rogue patrol. It was sanctioned, scheduled, possibly even orchestrated. That evening, just as the sun began to dip and the automatic porch lights flickered on along the block, Tom noticed something new. Small laminated placards had been affixed to several mailboxes. Not all, just some. His didn't have one. Neither did their closest neighbors, Mr. Ellis, an elderly man they'd only spoken to twice, both times in whispers. The signs bore the phrase, compliant resident, in bold serif font, followed by a small QR code and a signature line that was blank. No title, just a signature. Lena returned from her walk 10 minutes later. She'd chosen not to wear the beige set. She had her usual windbreaker, dark joggers, hair tied up. Unremarkable by any standard, but not in Benson Park. She approached the door, paused when she saw Tom standing on the porch, and followed his gaze toward the mailboxes. When she saw the placards, she didn't blink. Social profiling, she said. Testing thresholds. That night, Tom reviewed the footage from the door camera again. He slowed the section where the fake patrolman approached Lena. The taller one's hand rested near a side holster, and not quite threatening, but positioned for intimidation. Neither had ID, neither offered names. They had spoken like men following orders, not enforcing them. The most disturbing moment came when one of them, thinking the camera too far to hear, muttered under his breath as they walked away. She's not responding. Might need escalation. Tom couldn't sleep. Around 2 a.m, he stood in the hallway, looking through the crack in the curtains toward the empty street. It wasn't quiet, it was waiting. The whole place felt like a stage. Every hedge, every car in the driveway, every dim porch light. All of it seemed curated, controlled. He didn't believe in paranoia, but he believed in patterns, and the pattern here was tightening. This wasn't an ordinary case of neighborhood oversight. It was something more deliberate, something designed to see who would resist, and how far they'd go to make them submit. The following days blurred into one another, not because they were monotonous, but because the pressure became constant and suffocating. Nothing exploded. Nothing escalated in a way that could be reported to the police or brought before a court. That was the most disturbing part. There was no violence, no shouting, no direct confrontation. Just a slow, deliberate tightening of a noose that neither Tom nor Lena could trace back to a single source. Everything was just suggestive enough to seem coincidental, but systematic enough to be impossible to dismiss. It began with the mail. First, certain letters and packages they were expecting never arrived, even when verified delivered by the sender. Lena ordered a batch of standard documents sent through a secure government courier system, a test in part. The courier confirmed drop-off, but the envelope was gone by the time they checked the porch. Tom installed a secondary hidden camera focused specifically on the mailbox and walk path, separate from the door cam, and set it to trigger on motion rather than face recognition. The next morning, the lens was cracked, cleanly, as if someone had known exactly where it was hidden and disabled it with a single strike from a blunt tool. The following afternoon, Tom drove to a nearby hardware store to pick up additional mounts and cabling. When he returned, he noticed a small square of chalk drawn near the base of their driveway. It looked like part of a child's hopscotch grid at first glance, but it wasn't near any path, and no other driveways had anything similar. It was a 7x7 square with a diagonal slash and a small triangle in the corner. Lena measured it, photographed it, and cross-referenced it with coded communication systems used in housing clearance operations. It was a mark, not for children, not accidental. It indicated non-integrated. Whoever left it wasn't in a hurry. They wanted it seen. They wanted them to understand that their house had been officially labeled. Later that week, Lena returned home to find the gate to the backyard slightly ajar. It was a coded lock, a high-end model Tom had installed himself. No visible damage, no forced entry. Inside, nothing appeared stolen or touched. But their dog, a mutt named Hallie, was cowering beneath the porch steps, tail between her legs, ears flattened. Lena crouched beside her and immediately noticed a thin red welt along her side, a line no longer than a few inches. It wasn't deep, but it wasn't an accident. Someone had been inside. Someone had touched their dog. Someone had wanted to send a message. Quiet, personal, and impossible to trace. Tom filed a formal complaint with the local management committee, attaching the incident and the cracked camera footage. Within 48 hours, they received a cold, pre-formatted email. Dear residents, thank you for your input. Your concern has been reviewed by the Community Integrity Panel. At this time, no violations have been recorded. We remind all residents to secure their property appropriately and avoid misinterpreting minor events as targeted behavior. Harmony begins with trust. There was no name attached, no contact information, just a faceless, calculated wall. That weekend, they hosted no guests. They didn't leave the house unless necessary. Still, the pressure didn't abate. On Sunday morning, their trash cans were tipped over onto the street. Not dumped, tipped, perfectly balanced in opposite directions as if arranged. A single paper was laid on top of the recycling bin, a printed outline of a woman in silhouette, arms behind her back, head bowed, as if in submission. No words, no title, no watermarks, just the image. Tom didn't say anything. He burned it in the sink without comment. Lena, who had remained quiet throughout, began preparing a data transfer. She didn't want this information to sit solely on their devices. She uploaded everything, video, logs, photographs, documentation, to a remote server used for classified field logs, not as an emergency report, but as a passive flag. If something were to happen, the system would automatically escalate the stored evidence for review. She didn't want to act prematurely, didn't want to draw attention to herself in a way that could trigger a full blowout. This operation, after all, required observation. She needed to stay embedded, but she was also no longer willing to wait passively. On Monday morning, as Tom prepared coffee and Lena scanned news feeds on a secure tablet, their doorbell rang. The screen flashed, 2 uniformed men once again. Not the same pair as before, but the uniforms were nearly identical. This time, however, they brought a third person, a woman in a business suit, well-tailored, gray with a subtle pinstripe, clipboard in hand. She smiled at the camera, but her smile never reached her eyes. Lena opened the door but didn't invite them in. The woman introduced herself as Cassandra Ewell from the Neighborhood Conduct Evaluation Board, a title no one had ever mentioned before. She claimed they were following up on recent irregularities in behavioral compliance. Lena asked for identification. The woman presented a card, no hologram, no state seal, just a barcode and her name printed in black on white. The two men remained silent. "We're simply conducting a follow-up to ensure that our environment remains cohesive," Cassandra said. "It appears there may have been confusion about expectations and attire. We'd like to walk through your residence for a brief observational review. Nothing invasive, I assure you. Think of it as a standard wellness check." She said it with the practiced tone of someone used to being obeyed. Lena didn't blink. "I don't consent to entry. This is private property." Tom appeared behind her, arms folded. "If there's an issue, we'd prefer written communication. Any attempt to enter without a warrant will be recorded and forwarded to our legal representative." The woman paused, held her smile like a mask for 3 more seconds, then nodded. "Very well. But understand that non-cooperation will reflect on your compliance record. We strive for unity here. Disruption is contagious." As they turned to leave, Tom noticed one of the men subtly brushing his palm across the outer wall beside the door, leaving something. After they were gone, he found it. A small adhesive disc, no larger than a coin. A wireless beacon. He crushed it beneath his heel. Lena didn't speak for several minutes afterward. They both knew now. The game had moved past social pressure. This was direct provocation. They weren't just being watched anymore. They were being processed. Step by step, professionally, quietly, systematically. By midweek, the neighborhood no longer pretended to be neutral. The smiles from neighbors became scarce. Nods were replaced by cold glances and even routine gestures, like returning a misplaced parcel or waving during a morning jog, had ceased. People avoided Tom and Lena entirely. A few stared openly, but most simply pretended they didn't exist. The illusion of community cracked, and what was left behind wasn't hostility, it was coordination. There was no spontaneity in Benson Park anymore. It wasn't just conformity, it was direction. Someone, somewhere, had flipped a switch, and the neighborhood had adjusted itself to a new protocol. That same morning, Lena received a formal invitation, delivered via a manila envelope slid under their door without knocking. Inside was a printed letter, perfectly formatted and free of typographical errors. It was labeled Community Compliance Review Panel, Mandatory Presence Request. The letter stated that her recent pattern of visual deviation and failure to participate in integration rituals required her to attend a meeting at the neighborhood administrative building. It was scheduled for Friday at 2 p.m., and her attendance was described not as requested, but as anticipated to ensure continuity. The language was eerily vague, constructed in a way that implied authority without legally claiming any. Tom insisted they not go. Lena, however, disagreed. She knew something that Tom didn't. This wasn't just about observation anymore. This was a maneuver, a tightening. These review meetings weren't procedural, they were pressure points. She'd seen it in reports from other regions. Cases where neighborhood oversight bodies operated with no legal grounding, but imposed psychological coercion until residents either submitted or vacated. The language of the letter mirrored those patterns perfectly. But unlike most cases, Lena wasn't going to record the event passively. She was going to push. Before the meeting, Lena sent a short encrypted message through the classified channel. Phase shift detected, perimeter compromised, moving to passive confrontation. The response was minimal, just a 2-word directive. Proceed clean. It meant no exposure, no direct federal leverage, and no confrontation unless under duress. She wasn't there to win. She was there to document, to extract the truth from beneath layers of bureaucracy, social conditioning, and manipulation. The administrative building was a 2-story colonial-style structure that used to be a library, now refitted with tinted windows, surveillance domes, and an intercom-controlled entryway. Lena entered alone. Tom stayed behind but monitored the hidden comm unit she wore beneath her jacket. Inside, she was greeted not with hostility, but with the polished efficiency of a customer service desk. The receptionist offered her tea. She declined. Within minutes, she was led to a side room, windowless, brightly lit, with a rounded table and 5 chairs. 3 were already occupied. Cassandra Ewell sat in the center. To her left was a man in a navy suit who introduced himself simply as Mr. Henderson. No title, no position. To her right was a woman with an iPad who never looked up. Cassandra opened the meeting with a tone that could have been taken from a therapist's session. She spoke softly, referring to Lena's behavior as individualistically inclined and unstructured in visual presentation. She mentioned the arrival clothing set, the marked decline in social engagement, and the increased digital opacity surrounding Lena's home network, code for the digital security protocols Lena had activated. Each concern was stated not as accusation, but as a barrier to harmony. Lena listened silently, making no facial expression, her hands calmly folded on the table. Mr. Henderson eventually leaned forward. "Mrs. Baxter," he said, "we've seen these situations escalate in ways that aren't beneficial for anyone involved. The patterns you're exhibiting are not uncommon, but they're rarely constructive. In most cases, there's a simple solution: alignment. That's all we ask. Align with us. Be a part of something healthier." It wasn't phrased like a threat, but the implication was unmistakable. This was behavioral conditioning in corporate packaging, identity realignment via repetition, and public compliance. The goal wasn't to break her, it was to reprogram her. That was the middle point of the operation. Shift from fear to persuasion, from resistance to exhaustion. Lena raised one eyebrow. "I see," she said. "And if I decline to align?" Cassandra gave a small, deliberate sigh. "That would be unfortunate. The next stage involves formal assessments, home inspections, extended observational periods. These tend to create discomfort for everyone, but we trust you'll avoid that path." The words were dipped in sugar, but the message was acid. After exactly 22 minutes, Lena was dismissed. No signature was requested, no documents were presented. It was all verbal, no record, no trail, just pressure. But Lena had recorded every word. The hidden audio transmitter had transmitted the full conversation to an encrypted storage node in real time. She left the building and walked calmly back to the house, where Tom met her on the porch. "Well?" he asked. Lena looked at him with a strange, unreadable calm. "They've moved to phase 2. Soft coercion. They think we'll break from isolation." That night, the air felt different. Not just outside, but inside the house. They both knew now it wouldn't stay soft. The tone would change. The smiles would fade completely. They were past the halfway point. The system had stopped trying to convince them. Next, it would begin to punish them. The change didn't arrive with a siren or a warning. It arrived with a leak in the ceiling of the laundry room. At first, Tom thought it was a plumbing issue. A slow, steady drip against the tile, forming a shallow pool near the baseboard. But after crawling into the crawl space and inspecting every visible pipe himself, he realized the water wasn't coming from their house. It was seeping in from the shared wall with the neighboring property, the one technically owned by a holding company linked to the neighborhood's management entity. When he tried to reach the neighbor whose name was still posted on the mailbox, the call failed. When he knocked on the door, no one answered. There was music playing softly inside. He left a note in a waterproof sleeve and slid it under the door. The following morning, the sleeve was gone, and in its place was a perfectly blank piece of white paper. No response, no signature, no acknowledgement. Just deliberate emptiness. To Lena, it was clear what this was. Water was one of the oldest pressure tactics. Quiet, insidious, and difficult to prove as intentional. At nearly the same time, their garbage collection was skipped for the 3rd consecutive week. No explanation, no note. Yet, every other house on the street had bins cleared and returned neatly to the curb. When Tom contacted the sanitation company, he was asked for a 4-digit service code that didn't exist in their registration. When he tried to bypass the prompt, the line disconnected. The car that had been parked in front of their home for over a week, an unregistered gray sedan, was suddenly gone. And painted on the curb in its place was a faint red line, thin and barely visible unless caught in the right light. Lena didn't need a translation. It wasn't a warning. It was a boundary, an isolation perimeter. She uploaded a second encrypted data set to the federal server, marking it for legal readiness. If anything happened, if they disappeared, or their communications were severed, everything they'd recorded would be routed for immediate analysis and matched to previously documented harassment cases. It wouldn't save them in the moment, but it would ensure the story didn't disappear with them. They didn't sleep through the night. Not because of fear, but because the atmosphere had changed. They stayed dressed, boots by the door, bags partially packed. Around the perimeter, every motion detector triggered simultaneously. Tom went to the monitors, but every feed was static. Not darkness, interference. They were being jammed. Lena rebooted the power through a backup system she'd installed without logging it into any smart grid. When the cameras came back online, the yard was empty, but something had been left on the front steps. A child's lacquered music box. Inside was a lullaby neither of them recognized. Tucked into the velvet lining beneath the mechanism was a black and white photograph of them, taken from a position that had to have been within their hedge. The timestamp was 2 days prior. It wasn't just surveillance, it was presence. Someone had been close. Close enough to photograph them through their window. Close enough to move in silence across their lawn. Close enough to leave something behind. Lena dismantled the box. There were no active trackers. The message wasn't digital, it was human, psychological, precise. Later that day, the management body filed an official disturbance report, accusing the Baxters of causing emotional unrest and undermining the peace of the community. Their use of private surveillance systems was framed as a violation. Their refusal to engage in community programming was described as an act of dissonance. The letter wasn't delivered through the mail but placed under their door, folded and sealed in transparent film. The accusations were couched in language that mimicked legality without ever touching it. Lena's response was short. A forwarded contact for legal correspondence and a single line. Further communication will be routed through council. The house lost power again. This time, not the neighborhood, just their home. Every breaker was tripped, the generator bypassed. Their smart devices reset. When Tom walked the house, he found the tool chest in the garage had been opened. 2 socket wrenches were missing. No prints, no other signs of intrusion. Just another perfect cut in the fabric of their autonomy. Across the street, a man neither of them recognized appeared with a folding table and a clipboard. He sat silently, occasionally glancing up at their home, making marks on his paper. When Tom stepped outside to confront him, the man stood, packed his things, and left without a word. After he vanished, more homes received new laminated tags on their mailboxes. The Baxters received a plain slip of paper bearing only a red X. There were no more attempts to communicate. No more scripted politeness. The machine had shifted tone. Lena began finalizing a contingency exit. Quiet routes, secure locations, non-traceable movement. But that wasn't her focus. They weren't preparing to run. They were preparing to finish the recording. Not just of the intimidation, but of the structure behind it. The purpose. The method. That evening, a coded message arrived through her secure terminal. 4 words, no name, no embellishment. Transmission received. Do not yield. Lena sat at the dining table, lights dimmed, the hum of the refrigerator the only ambient sound. Tom placed a cup of coffee next to her without saying anything. She didn't need to explain what was coming. He already understood. The next stage wouldn't be about scaring them. It would be about removing them. Quietly, neatly, legally. Unless they moved first. The culmination didn't arrive as a confrontation. It came with paperwork, identical envelopes, and a knock on the door that lasted exactly 3 times. When Tom opened it, he was greeted by a courier dressed not in uniform, but in casual business attire. Slacks, white shirt, plastic badge clipped to his belt that read, Neighborhood Affairs Liaison. The man said nothing. He handed over 2 thick envelopes, nodded politely, and turned without a word, walking down the driveway with mechanical precision. Inside the envelopes were formal notices, each labeled Conduct Arbitration Review, Mandatory Residential Interview. The phrasing was sterile, but the meaning was crystal clear. It was a hearing, a final attempt to reframe their resistance as instability. to put a name to their refusal and process them as a disruption. Lena read both letters carefully. They were structured like court summons but held no legal seal, no county endorsement, no judicial reference. Yet they mimicked the design and tone of official litigation, a passive trap. Appear, and they legitimized the authority. Refuse, and they were labeled non-compliant, the illusion of choice. But she also knew this was the moment they'd been documenting for. The fabricated chain of authority was complete. It had wrapped itself in enough false structure to appear real, and now it would try to enforce itself. That's when Lena decided to break protocol. She contacted her embedded legal conduit, a man operating under federal discretion, and gave him a single directive: deploy visibility. The goal wasn't confrontation. It wasn't to expose herself. It was to elevate the matter to a realm the local system couldn't control. A public notary acting under sealed authorization would appear at the hearing site, not to interrupt, but to witness, not to speak, but to certify. If the neighborhood committee attempted any form of enforcement, that act would become part of the permanent federal record. The day of the hearing, Tom and Lena arrived at the administrative building precisely on time. The structure was quiet, the lot nearly empty, save for one vehicle with municipal plates parked near the side. As they entered, there were no greetings, no neighbors loitering in the lobby, only the receptionist from before, who motioned silently toward the corridor. They were led into a medium-sized room that resembled a conference hall but stripped of any personality. White walls, steel-framed chairs, a rectangular table at the far end. Behind it sat 5 individuals. Cassandra Ewell at the center, flanked by 2 men in identical suits and 2 women in muted gray blouses. They didn't introduce themselves. Cassandra opened with practiced serenity. Mr. and Mrs. Baxter, thank you for attending. Today's review is not a punitive measure, but an opportunity for reorientation. We're here to discuss recent actions which have, intentionally or otherwise, disrupted the cohesion of our environment. We invite you to participate in an open dialogue about the shared responsibilities of residency. Tom didn't answer. Lena remained still. They both waited. Cassandra continued. It's been brought to our attention that your property employs excessive surveillance, disrupts neighboring peace, and has generated a perception of resistance to integration. These behaviors, when left unaddressed, can lead to deterioration in community values. We're prepared to offer a resolution: voluntary reassignment to a transitional sector. Lena spoke at last. A reassignment implies jurisdiction. We've seen no documentation that confirms the legitimacy of your authority. Until such evidence is provided, we will decline any suggestions or mandates. The panel remained unfazed, as if expecting this line. One of the men leaned forward and adjusted a folder on the table. Authority in Benson Park is derived through contractual participation in neighborhood initiatives. Continued residence implies consent. Tom's voice was calm. We never signed anything. We inherited no contract. Implied authority is not the same as legal authority. Show us the documentation. Cassandra smiled almost sadly. This is why dialogue matters. Misunderstandings become division. This community thrives on shared commitment. If you cannot or will not participate, then the next phase becomes necessary. At that moment, the door opened. A woman entered, dressed in dark green, carrying a briefcase and a silver notebook. She didn't say a word. She sat in the observer's seat and opened the notebook. The panel's demeanor shifted subtly. One of the women on the end whispered something to Cassandra. The hearing paused for a few seconds, then resumed. But now the rhythm had changed. Cassandra folded her hands. Very well, you've made your position clear. We regret that it's come to this. Formal documentation will be issued shortly. Lena rose from her chair. If any attempt is made to interfere with our residents again, if our power is cut, if our mail is blocked, if surveillance devices are found on our property, we will consider it harassment and respond accordingly. Tom stood beside her. The panel did not respond. They gathered their folders silently as if the matter had already moved beyond them. Lena and Tom exited the building without another word. That night, the neighborhood was unusually quiet. No porch lights on. No cars moved. no evening walkers or joggers. A stillness settled over Benson Park like a paused video. Lena sat on the porch, Tom by her side watching the street. The woman from the hearing, the Federal Observer, had already filed her report, and though no one had acknowledged it, the presence of oversight had altered the path. The system they were fighting was built on invisibility. No names, no faces, no direct threats. But it was now recorded, documented, and that made it vulnerable. Lena didn't expect the neighborhood to crumble, but the structure that had allowed it to operate with impunity had now been compromised. A crack had formed, and cracks, no matter how hairline, only grow wider with pressure. A week passed in silence. No more notices arrived, no vehicles loitered near their home, and the chalk markings on the curb were scrubbed away during the night, replaced by the same fresh gray paint used throughout the neighborhood. Their garbage was collected without issue, the electricity remained stable, and the surveillance cameras caught no new anomalies. On the surface, everything had returned to normal, but it wasn't normal. It was retreat. Controlled, coordinated retreat. Lena knew the difference between resolution and recalibration. The system hadn't been dismantled. It had simply closed the curtain, changed the backdrop, and adjusted the tempo. The control mechanism that had suffocated the neighborhood hadn't been defeated. It had been documented, exposed, and quietly corrected. That was victory enough for now. Tom spent more time on the porch, sipping his coffee slowly, no longer checking the shadows every few minutes. He spoke little about what had happened, not because he wanted to forget, but because it didn't need to be said. They had stood their ground, survived the slow suffocation that had broken others before them. The neighbors, now cautiously re-emerging from behind their fences and hedges, gave them uncertain nods, as if unsure how to interact with people who had stared into the center of the machine and remained unbent. Lena returned those nods with a calm, disinterested neutrality. The fear in their eyes was still there, just quieter now, tucked beneath routine smiles and borrowed civility. One afternoon, an official-looking vehicle stopped briefly near the house. A man in a plain black jacket exited, placed a small envelope into their mailbox, and drove off without looking back. Inside was a single sheet of paper. No heading, no explanation. Just a line of text. Presence confirmed. Observation complete. No name, no seal. But Lena understood its purpose. The operation had reached its natural end. The environment had been mapped, the mechanism tested, and the resistance measured. She had not been there to dismantle. She had been there to reveal. That evening, she packed the last of her encrypted devices into a flat black case and placed it under the bed. Her mission was finished. She would submit the full report through secured channels, then resume her original identity. No aliases, no surveillance, no embedded roles. Just Lena Baxter, wife, neighbor, resident. She and Tom sat in the quiet, the weight of vigilance slowly lifting. The storm had passed, but the structure remained, scarred and unsettled. Still, they had endured it together, and in doing so, altered its trajectory. Some fights didn't end with explosions or sirens. Some ended with quiet departures and permanent records, and in that silence they had won.